Hey guys, tonight we slip into a Hellenistic army camp just as twilight fades and the first stars blink on above a sea of low tents and darkened shields. You feel dust cool under your sandals, smell faint barley and ash in the air, and sense that peculiar hush that only arrives when thousands of people are trying very hard not to be heard. Somewhere nearby, an ember glows like a tiny red eye, and you realize you probably won't survive this if you trip over a pot or sneeze at the wrong moment. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and local time in the comments too. It's strangely soothing to imagine this story drifting into bedrooms all over the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step forward slowly, copying the way everyone else moves, careful and deliberate, as if the ground itself might complain. The camp spreads out in neat rows, a grid of canvas and rope that looks almost modern in its organization. This order isn't accidental. Hellenistic armies inherited a tradition of structured camps from earlier Greek warfare, with designated zones for soldiers, officers, animals, and kitchens. You feel a tiny thrill at standing in the middle of that living blueprint of logistics and discipline. Near the center, you spot the cooks. They crouch around shallow hearths, barely more than scooped-out circles in the earth, banked with ash and stones. No roaring flames here, just dull orange embers breathing softly. You kneel beside one hearth and hold your hands over it, feeling a warmth so gentle it's more like a suggestion than heat. Joke 1, this is less campfire vibes and more emotionally supportive coal. A cook hands you a clay pot already darkened by soot and time. Inside, barley grains soak quietly in water. Here's a mainstream historical fact you casually carry like an oddly specific fun fact. Barley was a staple ration for many Hellenistic soldiers, often issued as grain to be ground and cooked into porridge or bread. You stir the grains with a wooden spoon worn silky smooth by countless nights just like this. The sound it makes is barely audible, softer than a whisper, and you suddenly understand why these people would be terrifying at hide and seek. A quirky tidbit floats into your mind as you work. Some ancient cooks supposedly lay fig leaves or damp cloth over pots not just to trap steam, but to muffle the faint clink of bubbling. You glance around and, sure enough, see a stack of broad leaves waiting nearby like nature's noise-canceling headphones. Joke 2, apple, but make it ancient and biodegradable. Oil lamps flicker on around the camp, their flames turned low and shaded so the light spills downward instead of out. You feel wrapped in a small bubble of ember glow. Somewhere, a mule shifts and jingles a harness ring, and three cooks freeze in perfect unison, glaring at it. The mule looks deeply apologetic. Joke 3, even the livestock knows it's past its bedtime. You stir again, slow and steady, coaxing warmth into the barley without letting it boil. Historians still argue whether Hellenistic camps were truly as silent at night as later writers suggest, or whether there was always a low murmur of human noise that enemies simply learned to ignore. Watching the careful choreography around you, you suspect the truth lives somewhere in between. The sky deepens into indigo. The embers glow. The camp breathes quietly around you. And you keep stirring, easing food into existence while an army sleeps. You stay crouched by the hearth as the light fades even further, and the embers begin to look like tiny, sleepy stars scattered in a bowl of ash. A cook beside you gently nudges one ember with a stick, not to make it brighter, just to reposition it so the heat spreads more evenly under the pot. The movement is so careful it feels ceremonial, like he's tucking the fire in for the night. Joke 1, bedtime stories for embers are apparently a thing now. These hearths are nothing like the dramatic campfires from movies. They're shallow pits scraped into the soil, ringed with stones, and buried under layers of ash that act like insulation. This isn't just vibes, it's physics and survival. Here's your mainstream historical fact for the evening. Ancient armies, including Hellenistic ones, commonly banked their fires under ash to preserve heat for hours while minimizing light and smoke. It saved fuel, kept food warm, and, most importantly, helped avoid broadcasting the camp's location to unfriendly neighbors with sharp swords and poor intentions. You're handed a small shovel and invited, with a nod, to help tend another hearth. You scoop a thin veil of ash over a faintly glowing coal, watching the light dim to a dull pulse. The heat still radiates upward, steady and quiet, like a patient animal curled up to nap. The smell of ash and warm earth mixes with barley and herbs, and you breathe it in, instantly 10% calmer and 90% hungrier. A quirky tidbit slips into your awareness as you work. Some ancient cooks supposedly believed certain types of wood burned louder than others, not in sound but in spirit, and avoided resinous pine at night because its crackling was thought to anger the gods of stealth. You look at the pile of firewood nearby and notice it's mostly dense, dark hardwood. Either this is brilliant tactical planning or deeply committed superstition. Honestly, probably both. You pause to listen. The camp isn't silent, not really. There's the faint rustle of cloth, a distant cough, the soft clink of a ladle against pottery that makes everyone flinch. Joke 2, you've seen bomb squads move with less tension. Still, compared to daytime bustle, this is a masterclass in restraint. Even your own breathing feels suspiciously loud, so you start inhaling like you're trying not to wake a baby who's also armed. Historians still argue whether ancient cooks intentionally engineered hearths for acoustic stealth or whether the quiet was simply a byproduct of low heat and nighttime caution. As you watch a cook shape the ash with his fingers like sculpting snow, you get the sense that, intentional or not, they were very aware of how sound traveled in the dark. You gently slide your barley pot a finger's width closer to the heat. The grains are swelling now, softening into something porridge adjacent. Steam barely goes to the surface, and you quickly lay a damp cloth over the pot to trap it. Joke 3, congratulations, you've invented the world's first stealth slow cooker. An officer passes behind you, boots wrapped in cloth, murmuring a quiet thanks to the cooks. You feel a weird flicker of pride, like you personally are holding the army together with oatmeal and vibes. The embers continue their soft glow, hidden and obedient, and you realize this whole operation runs on tiny, thoughtful adjustments made by people who know exactly how much light, heat, and noise is too much. You settle back into your crouch, hands warm, heart steady, and keep tending the invisible fires that make dinner possible without making war more likely. You ease yourself up from your crouch, joints popping just a little too loudly for your liking, and immediately freeze like a startled deer. Nobody reacts. Crisis averted. You pick up a woven basket of grain and follow a cook toward the edge of the kitchen zone, where a few low tables and sacks are arranged in tidy rows. The camp smells faintly of damp canvas and olive oil now, and somewhere in the distance a sentry clears his throat, a sound that feels scandalously loud. You tip the basket and let barley grains spill into a shallow wooden tray. They make a soft, dry whisper as they settle, and you instinctively wince, even though it's barely louder than your own thoughts. Here's your mainstream historical fact for this stretch of the night. Hellenistic armies depended on complex supply networks that moved grain, oil, wine, and dried foods across enormous distances, often by pack animals, wagons, and river barges. Without that logistical backbone, no amount of battlefield brilliance would have kept an army fed for long. You imagine caravans inching along dusty roads from Egypt, Anatolia, or Mesopotamia, sacks of barley bouncing gently on mulebacks, all so you can stand here in the dark worrying about whether grain is being too noisy. It's humbling and slightly absurd. Joke 1, you are the final boss in a very long and expensive barley delivery quest. A cook shows you a ledger board scratched with symbols and numbers. You don't understand most of it, but you get the vibe. Inventory management, ancient edition. Each sack is counted, each ration roughly calculated. You're struck by how modern it all feels. Someone taps a mark next to barley and nods, satisfied. Logistics is the unglamorous hero of history, and right now it smells like cereal. A quirky tidbit drifts in as you pour grain into smaller cloth bags. Some ancient sources hint that cooks and quartermasters hid extra grain in false bottom chests or buried caches near camps, just in case supply lines were cut. You glance at the ground like it might be hiding secrets. Joke 2, congratulations, you're now standing on the world's least exciting pirate treasure. You carry a bag to a low grinding station where two soldiers rotate a hand mill, stones wrapped in cloth to muffle the scraping sound. You add grain to the top funnel and watch it disappear between the stones, emerging below as coarse flour. The rhythm is slow, deliberate, almost meditative. You fall into sync with it, passing grain, collecting flour, trying not to sneeze because that would be socially catastrophic. Historians still argue whether Hellenistic supply systems were centrally organized by state bureaucracies or relied more heavily on private contractors and local requisitioning. As you watch grain turn into flour in the dark, you suspect the answer is a messy combination of all of the above, which, honestly, is how most things work. A breeze lifts the edge of your tunic, and you shiver. The cook beside you hands you a cup of diluted wine, barely warm. You sip it quietly, tasting grapes and faint smoke. Joke 3, this is the least fun wine tasting you've ever attended, and somehow the most meaningful. You look back toward the hearths, glowing faintly, and realize every spoonful of porridge tomorrow morning will be the end result of moments like this, quiet, careful, logistical moments. You shoulder another bag of grain and step back into the amber glow, part of a supply chain that stretches across continents and ends in a bowl. You drift back toward the hearths with a sack of freshly ground flour cradled against your chest like a sleepy cat. The glow of the embers feels warmer now, or maybe you're just getting emotionally attached to them. A cook motions you toward a low table scattered with tools, and you realize this is the quiet kitchen's version of a prep station. Everything here looks softened by time and intention, edges rounded, surfaces darkened, nothing shiny enough to catch stray light. You pick up a wooden ladle whose handle is wrapped in a strip of cloth. The fabric is stained with oil and smoke, but it makes the ladle feel padded, almost polite. Here's your mainstream historical fact for this moment. Ancient Mediterranean cooks used simple tools, wooden spoons, clay pots, stone mortars, and pestles, and in military camps these were often modified or maintained to be durable and quiet. You give the ladle a tiny test tap against a pot and immediately regret it, even though the sound is barely there. Joke 1, you have invented the concept of a guilty conscience for cookware. A cook shows you a stone mortar whose rim is wrapped in leather. He drops a few dried herbs into it, something that smells like thyme and maybe coriander, and begins to grind with slow, heavy circles. The leather deadens the scrape of stone on stone into a soft, dull hush. You take a turn, and the rhythm vibrates gently up your arms. It's oddly soothing, like crushing stress instead of spices. Joke 2, welcome to the original mindfulness app, now with bonus rosemary. A quirky tidbit slips into your awareness as you work. Some French historical theories suggest camp cooks experimented with adding animal fat or wax to wooden tool handles to further muffle sound and improve grip. You glance at the ladle in your hand and sniff it. It smells faintly of olive oil and something meaty. Either this is ancient innovation or just very committed seasoning. You move to a stack of clay pots, each one nested inside another like ceramic dolls. A cook separates them with careful hands, setting them down on folded cloth so they don't clink together. The cloth looks like it's been repurposed from old tunics, frayed but clean. You suddenly feel very seen by history's recycling habits. Historians still argue whether such sound-dampening measures were deliberate design choices or simply practical adaptations that emerged over time. As you watch someone gently lower a pot onto a padded ring of woven reeds, you lean toward deliberate, because nobody is this careful by accident. You're handed a small knife with a bone handle wrapped in twine. It feels secure, quiet in your grip. You slice a few soft vegetables, maybe onions or leeks, on a thick wooden board laid over a sack of grain to muffle the thud. The knife makes a muted whispering sound, and you feel absurdly proud of yourself. Joke 3, you are now a certified stealth onion operative. Around you, the kitchen hums with barely audible activity. Ladles dip, mortars turn, cloth rustles. It's like being inside a living ASMR video sponsored by Ancient Logistics. You glance back at the barley pot you started earlier and give it a gentle stir with your padded ladle. The grains are thickening nicely, and steam goes to the surface again. You set the tools back exactly where you found them, suddenly respectful of their quiet little ecosystem. The embers glow. The herbs release their scent. And you keep working, learning the language of a kitchen that speaks almost entirely in silence. You carry a small bowl of barley back toward the grinding station, feeling oddly protective of it, like it might startle if you move too fast. The two soldiers at the mill nod at you, their faces ghostly in the low lamplight, and make room so you can add your share to the hopper. The stones turn slowly, their rhythm steady and patient, and you're careful to pour the grain in a thin stream so nothing crunches too loudly. Here's your mainstream historical fact for this part of the night. Hand-turned rotary querns were widely used in the Hellenistic world for grinding grain, both in civilian homes and military camps. They were portable, reliable, and required nothing but human muscle and time. You place your hands on the upper stone and help turn it, feeling the faint vibration travel up your arms as the barley disappears into flour below. Someone has wrapped strips of cloth around the rim and handle of the quern. The scraping sound of stone on stone is reduced to a low, sandy murmur. You lean in, listening, half expecting it to start screaming in protest like an offended rock. Joke 1. Turns out even geology appreciates a good bedtime routine. A quirky tidbit wanders into your thoughts as you work. A few fringe sources suggest that in some camps, grinding was scheduled specifically for nighttime because the cooler air reduced dust and static, making the process slightly quieter and cleaner. You glance at the faint flour drifting in the lamplight and nod. Ancient science, quietly winning. You fall into a rhythm, pour, turn, collect, repeat. Each motion is deliberate and economical, like everyone here is trying to minimize not just noise but wasted effort. A cook sets a folded blanket under the flour bowl to cushion it, and you suddenly realize how many layers of quiet engineering are happening at once. Joke 2. If silence had a union, these people would be its executive board. Historians still argue whether soldiers themselves routinely ground their own grain or whether specialized camp staff handled most of that labor in large Hellenistic armies. Watching these two soldiers work the quern with the focus of monks, you suspect the answer depended on how exhausted everyone already was and how urgently dinner needed to exist. You pause to brush flour from your hands, clapping them together once, softly, then immediately freezing in horror at the tiny puff of sound. Nobody reacts. You exhale. Joke 3. You have just invented the world's quietest round of applause for yourself. A breeze slips through the camp again, carrying the scent of embers and herbs. The flour bowl fills, pale and fine, and you carry it back toward the hearths, cradling it like a very boring baby. You hand it off to a cook, who murmurs thanks and folds it into a pot of warm water, stirring slowly. You watch the flour vanish into the liquid, thickening it into something comforting and substantial. The quiet labor, the steady rhythm, the shared unspoken rules, it all feels strangely intimate. You step back, hands dusted white, and realize you're part of a choreography that's been repeated, night after night, across centuries of marching armies. You wipe your hands on your tunic, breathe in the warm, grainy air, and drift back into position, ready for whatever quiet task comes next. You return to the hearth just in time to see a cook lift a lid from one of the clay pots, releasing a breath of steam so gentle it barely disturbs the air. The stew inside glows faintly in the lamplight, thick and dark, with barley grains and vegetables drifting lazily like tired fish. You lean closer and inhale, catching notes of onion, herbs, and something savory you can't quite name. Your stomach responds immediately, because it has zero loyalty to your dignity. Here's your mainstream historical fact for this quiet moment. Slow-cooked stews and porridges were a common way to feed large ancient armies, since they stretched ingredients, conserved fuel, and could be kept warm for long periods without constant attention. You take a padded ladle and give the stew a slow stir, careful not to let it bump the pot sides. The surface ripples like a very polite lake. A quirky tidbit bubbles up in your mind as you work. Some French traditions claim cooks would toss a small pebble into large stew pots, believing it encouraged even bubbling and prevented burning. You squint into the pot, half expecting to see a rock living its best life at the bottom. Joke 1. Congratulations, dinner, you now have emotional support gravel. You slide the pot a fraction of an inch farther from the embers, adjusting the heat by instinct more than measurement. Steam goes upward again, and you quickly drape a damp cloth over the lid to trap it. The cloth darkens as it absorbs moisture, and you feel absurdly accomplished, like you just unlocked a stealth cooking achievement. Historians still argue whether ancient cooks had precise temperature control techniques or relied entirely on experience and visual cues. Watching the way this cook wreathed the stew's surface like tea leaves, you suspect vibes played a surprisingly large role. The camp around you feels even quieter now, as if everyone has collectively decided this is the sacred hour of simmering. A soldier tiptoes past carrying a stack of wooden bowls, each one nested inside another, separated by thin scraps of cloth. He nearly trips, recovers, and freezes, eyes wide, waiting for someone to shush him. Nobody does. Joke 2, the bowls and the floor have just signed a non-aggression pact. You take another ladle and dip it into a second pot, this one thinner, more like soup. The liquid slides back into the pot in a smooth ribbon, making almost no sound. You taste a drop from the ladle's edge, burning your tongue just a little. You do not yelp. You are a hero. Joke 3, this is what they mean by suffering for your art. A cook beside you sprinkles in a pinch of crushed herbs, letting them fall from a height of about 2 inches, because even gravity is being asked to keep it down. The scent blooms instantly, and you feel a weird surge of affection for this stew, like you've co-parented it. You settle onto a low stool, watching the pots breathe and steam in tiny, controlled sighs. The embers glow. The herbs infuse. The camp sleeps. And you keep tending the stews that barely whisper, feeding an army one silent bubble at a time. You shift closer to a low table where small bowls of dried leaves, seeds, and roots are arranged in neat, almost devotional rows. Each bowl is labeled with a scratched symbol you don't recognize, but the cooks seem to know exactly what everything is without looking twice. You pick up a pinch of something green and crumbly and roll it between your fingers. It smells sharp and comforting at the same time, like a forest trying to be helpful. Here's your mainstream historical fact for this softly scented moment. Hellenistic cooks used a wide range of herbs and spices, such as thyme, coriander, dill, cumin, and garlic, not only for flavor but also for preservation and digestion. You sprinkle a tiny amount into the stew, watching the flecks disappear into the dark surface like polite little swimmers. A cook leans in and murmurs something about not too much, tapping the bowl gently. You nod with exaggerated seriousness, because you do not want to be responsible for the battle of overtiming. Joke 1, somewhere in the future, a food critic is already judging you. A quirky tidbit drifts into your thoughts as you open another bowl. Some fringe accounts claim certain herbs were believed to ward off bad luck, evil spirits, or even enemy curses when added to soldiers' meals. You hesitate, then add a ceremonial extra pinch. This is either spiritual protection or you just made the stew slightly more Italian. You crush a few seeds in the padded mortar, turning them into fragrant dust. The smell blooms upward, warm and nutty. It makes the whole kitchen feel cozier, like the ancient version of lighting a scented candle called War Camp Serenity. Joke 2, available now in 3 calming battlefield aromas. Historians still argue whether these superstitions genuinely influenced cooking practices or were later embellishments layered onto practical routines. Watching how carefully the cook measures each herb, you suspect belief and habit were probably stirred together in the same pot. A soldier wanders past and pauses, inhaling deeply. He gives you a thumbs up, then remembers where he is and slowly lowers his hand back to his side. You share a solemn nod. Joke 3, this is the quietest 5-star review you've ever received. You add the crushed herbs to the stew, stirring slowly so nothing splashes. The surface darkens slightly, thickens slightly, smells significantly better. You feel a tiny glow of pride, which you immediately try to suppress because pride is loud. The herbs settle. The steam sighs. And you keep seasoning food and fate in equal measure, one silent pinch at a time. You drift toward a cluster of clay jars set into the ground, their rims just visible above the packed earth like the mouths of shy turtles. A cook lifts one lid a fraction of an inch, peeks inside, and then nods for you to come closer. You kneel and peer in too. Inside is dark red wine, diluted and gently warming from the earth's retained heat. It smells faintly sweet and smoky, like grapes that have accepted their fate. Here's your mainstream historical fact for this softly boozy interlude. Hellenistic soldiers commonly drank wine diluted with water, both to make supplies last longer and because undiluted wine was considered excessive and even uncivilized. You dip a small ladle into the jar and transfer some of the wine into a narrow neck pot, careful not to let the ladle clink against the ceramic. The liquid makes a barely audible glug, and you freeze, then relax when nobody flinches. A quirky tidbit floats into your mind as you add warm water from another pot. Some French traditions suggest camp cooks believe gently heated wine helps soldiers sleep more deeply and dream more pleasantly. You stir the mixture slowly, feeling like you're preparing the world's least regulated bedtime tea. Joke 1. Chamomile could never. You carry the pot closer to the embers, setting it on a padded ring of cloth so it won't knock against stone. The surface trembles slightly as it warms, releasing a soft, comforting aroma. A soldier approaches with a wooden cup, holding it with both hands like it's a sacred offering. You ladle in a portion, moving so slowly it feels theatrical. Historians still argue whether warm, diluted wine was issued regularly at night or reserved for special occasions like cold weather or pre-battle nerves. Watching the gratitude flicker across the soldier's face, you suspect it happened more often than official records admit. You move on to another jar, this one filled with water that's been infused with crushed herbs and citrus peels. You taste a drop. It's refreshing and faintly bitter. Joke 2. Congratulations, you've discovered ancient spa water. A cook whispers that this mixture helps with digestion and thirst. You nod solemnly, because hydration is apparently timeless wisdom. You pour some into small cups, lining them up neatly on a cloth-covered tray. A breeze drifts through the camp again, and you instinctively shield the pots with your body like an overprotective parent. Joke 3. You are now emotionally attached to beverages. You carry the tray toward the sleeping tents, footsteps slow and careful, delivering warmth and calm in liquid form. The camp remains hushed, the jars breathe quietly in the earth, and you keep brewing comfort for an army that barely stirs. You step into a darker corner of the camp where the lamplight barely reaches, and your eyes take a moment to adjust. Here, a low wooden table is set up with slabs of meat resting on thick boards, each piece wrapped loosely in cloth. A cook greets you with a quiet nod and hands you a small knife whose blade glints dully. You realize this is the starlight shift of food prep, where touch matters more than sight. Here's your mainstream historical fact for this nocturnal task. Hellenistic armies regularly consumed preserved meats, salted, dried, or smoked, alongside fresh cuts when available, especially during long campaigns. You unwrap a slab of salted meat and run your fingers gently over its surface, feeling the grain and firmness, orienting yourself before slicing. The knife slides through with a soft, controlled sound that makes you weirdly proud. A quirky tidbit drifts into your mind as you work. Some French traditions claim cooks massaged meat with oil and herbs at night, believing the darkness helped flavors settle in more deeply. You rub a little olive oil into the meat, mostly because it smells amazing and you are extremely on board with any excuse to moisturize dinner. You slice slowly, keeping each cut deliberate and even. The pieces fall onto the board with a barely audible thud, softened by the cloth beneath it. Joke 1. This is less chopping and more politely persuading meat to separate. Historians still argue whether fresh meat was commonly available to Hellenistic armies on campaign or reserved for special occasions like victories or religious festivals. As you portion out neat strips in the dark, you suspect the truth depended heavily on where the army happened to be standing and how cooperative the local livestock felt. A cook beside you salts the slices lightly, the grains falling like tiny stars. You mimic him, careful not to let the salt bowl clink. The air smells savory and clean, and your stomach does a little hopeful flip. You switch to another slab, this one softer, likely goat or sheep. You cut by feel, counting slices in your head. Joke 2. Congratulations, you are now a blindfolded contestant on Ancient Top Chef. A soldier approaches with a shallow pan. You arrange the meat inside it, laying the pieces flat so they won't overlap and steam too loudly later. He mouths a thank you and drifts away like a polite ghost. Historians still argue whether nighttime meat preparation was standard practice or just an occasional necessity driven by schedules and security concerns. Watching how smoothly everyone works in near darkness, you suspect it was more common than anyone bothered to write down. You wipe the knife clean on a cloth and wrap the remaining meat carefully. The lamplight flickers. The camp sighs in its sleep. And you keep preparing meat by starlight, feeding an army with your fingertips and a very quiet blade. You carry a heavy pot of stew toward a line of waiting bowls, each one set neatly on the ground with a folded scrap of cloth beneath it to keep it from clinking. The soldiers who stand nearby do not crowd or chatter, they simply hold their bowls and wait with the quiet patience of people who know dinner is inevitable and noise is optional. You feel a strange pressure in your chest, like you've been promoted to Minister of Soup. Here's your mainstream historical fact for this gentle moment of distribution. In Hellenistic armies, food was often issued in standardized rations, but officers and generals sometimes received slightly better portions or additional items like wine or meat. You dip your padded ladle into the pot and pour a measured portion into the first bowl, careful to keep the stream smooth and silent. The stew lands with a soft, wet sigh. A young soldier steps forward next, eyes bright in the lamplight. You give him the same portion as the last man. Somewhere behind you, a cook nods approvingly. Joke 1, you have just passed the ancient fairness audit. A quirky tidbit slips into your mind as you serve. Some fringe tales claim camp cooks occasionally slipped extra food to particularly brave or exhausted soldiers as a quiet morale boost. You hesitate, then add one discreet extra ladleful to a man whose armor looks more dented than fashionable. He notices, blinks, and gives you the smallest, most grateful nod in human history. Joke 2, congratulations, you are now an illegal soup philanthropist. Historians still argue whether strict ration equality was actually enforced in practice or whether favoritism and quiet generosity were common in real camps. Watching the subtle human negotiations happening around you, tiny nods, careful portions, unspoken gratitude, you strongly suspect it was the latter. An officer approaches with his own bowl, postured straight even in slippers. You serve him calmly, neither more nor less than anyone else. He raises an eyebrow, then relaxes and murmurs thanks. You feel absurdly proud, like you've just defused a social bomb with stew. The line moves steadily. Nobody speaks. Spoons are dipped slowly, bowls are carried away with two hands, and people retreat into the shadows to eat in silence. The camp smells warmer now, fuller, more alive. Your arms begin to ache slightly from holding the ladle, and you decide this is what ancient gym memberships looked like. Joke 3 arrives quietly, welcome to Soup CrossFit, Night Edition. You glance back at the hearths and see more pots waiting, more bowls lined up, more quiet hunger patiently behaving itself. You straighten your shoulders and keep serving, balancing rank and morale one ladle at a time, feeling like the calm center of a very polite food tornado. You step away from the serving line and follow a cook toward the far edge of the kitchen area, where the air smells less like stew and more like damp earth and crushed herbs. He gestures for you to crouch, and you both lower yourselves beside a shallow trench filled with gray ash and wilted leaves. With slow, careful motions, he begins to shovel a thin layer of soil over the ash, sealing in the faint warmth and, more importantly, the smell. Here's your mainstream historical fact for this quietly tactical moment. Ancient military camps took real precautions to conceal fires, food smells, and light, because any of those could reveal their position to enemies, especially during night operations. You take the shovel and mimic his movements, sprinkling earth over the ash until the hearth vanishes into the ground like it was never there. Joke 1, congratulations, you've just become a licensed crime scene cleaner for dinner. A quirky tidbit drifts into your mind as you work. Some fringe accounts suggest cooks burned aromatic herbs or dung to mask food smells drifting beyond camp. You glance at a small pile of dried herb stems and something that looks suspiciously like camel droppings. You decide not to ask follow-up questions and sprinkle in a few stems anyway, because stealth is about commitment. The cook hands you a cloth sack filled with crushed leaves and motions for you to hang it near the edge of the camp. You tie it to a tent pole, and a faint herbal scent drifts outward, confusing your nose and, hopefully, any enemy scouts with sensitive nostrils. Joke 2, you have just installed the world's first ancient air freshener. Historians still argue whether smell concealment was a deliberate tactical doctrine or simply a side effect of general camp hygiene and superstition. As you watch several cooks quietly erase every visible sign of cooking, you suspect it was both strategy and habit, layered together like the world's sneakiest lasagna. You move to a stack of bowls and pots that have been used and begin wiping them clean with damp cloths. Each piece is dried and wrapped before being nested inside another. The clink that almost happens makes your soul leave your body for half a second. It doesn't happen. You live. Joke 3, adrenaline, but make it ceramic. A soldier tiptoes past carrying a sack of leftovers, destined for a storage pit lined with straw and cooled by the night air. You help him lower it in and cover it with a wooden lid and more earth. The camp is becoming visually emptier by the minute, like a stage being struck after a very quiet play. You stand and brush dirt from your knees, looking around at a kitchen that now barely exists. The hearths are gone. The smells are muted. The tools are hidden. And you feel a strange satisfaction at having helped erase evidence of dinner, like a benevolent culinary ghost. The camp breathes. The night deepens. And you keep helping hide the quiet miracles that just fed an army. You wander back toward the center of the camp, hands finally idle, and find a few cooks sitting in a loose circle on folded cloaks. One of them pats the ground beside him, inviting you to join. You lower yourself carefully, grateful for a moment where nothing needs stirring, hiding, or seasoning. The air is cooler now, carrying only faint traces of stew and ash, like the memory of a meal rather than the meal itself. Here's your mainstream historical fact for this softer pause. In many ancient armies, including Hellenistic ones, cooks and support staff formed tight-knit groups with their own routines, traditions, and informal hierarchies, often staying together across long campaigns. You realize these people have likely shared hundreds of nights like this, crouched over embers, whispering recipes, and silently panicking about pottery noises. One cook begins tracing a small symbol in the dirt with his finger, something like an eye inside a circle. He murmurs that it's a charm for safe digestion and peaceful sleep. You nod solemnly, because this feels like the wrong moment to bring up modern probiotics. Joke 1, ancient gut health influencers were truly ahead of their time. A quirky tidbit floats into your thoughts as another cook quietly tells a story about a pot that cracked during a thunderstorm and was blamed for 3 days of bad luck. Some fringe tales suggest certain pots, knives, or ladles were believed to develop personalities over time, becoming either lucky or cursed depending on their history. You glance back toward the hearth's former location, half expecting your padded ladle to wink at you. Historians still argue whether these kinds of kitchen superstitions genuinely shape daily practices or were just campfire stories used to pass the time and bond groups together. Watching the way everyone listened seriously, you suspect belief itself was part of the morale ration. A soldier wanders past and drops a small loaf of flatbread near the circle as a quiet offering. Nobody speaks, but a cook breaks off a piece and hands it to you. You take it, whispering thanks, and chew slowly. It's dense, slightly smoky, and deeply comforting. Joke 2, congratulations, you have just unlocked the secret menu item called stuffed bread. Someone begins humming, barely audible, a low, tuneless sound that blends into the night like a friendly insect. Another cook joins in, then another, until there's a faint, wordless harmony floating above the tents. It feels intimate and strangely safe, like the camp itself is being tucked in. You lean back, staring up at the stars, feeling full in body and spirit. Joke 3, you came here for quiet cooking and accidentally joined a very low-budget ancient spa retreat. The hum fades. The bread disappears. And you sit there with these people, wrapped in odd customs and whispered stories, feeling the human side of an army that history usually shows you only in armor and bloodless numbers. You rise quietly from the circle of cooks, joints protesting in a very polite, muted way, and drift back toward the now empty kitchen space. The ground is cool under your feet, and the faint impressions of hearths and tables are barely visible, like footprints the camp is already trying to forget. The night feels thicker now, heavier with stars, and you become acutely aware of how far sound can travel when everything else is asleep. Here's your mainstream historical fact for this reflective stretch. Ancient historians like Polybius and later Roman writers commented on camp discipline and night routines, noting how order, silence, and predictable schedules were seen as essential to military success. You imagine an officer somewhere writing stern notes about quiet hours while you're out here philosophizing about porridge. You pause and listen. There's still noise, technically. A distant cough. Leather creaking as someone shifts in their tent. A horse snorting softly. But compared to daytime chaos, it's nothing. Joke 1, this is the original Do Not Disturb mode, and it's aggressively enforced. A quirky tidbit drifts into your mind as you watch a sentry walk his slow loop. Some French historians suggest that complete silence was never the goal, and that camps intentionally maintained a low, constant background noise so sudden sounds wouldn't stand out as much. You tilt your head, considering it. Ambient noise, ancient edition. Someone should sell this as a playlist. Historians still argue whether Hellenistic camps were capable of true operational silence or whether later writers exaggerated their discipline to make generals look smarter. Standing here, you feel both impressed and skeptical. Humans are noisy creatures. Expecting thousands of them to behave like ninjas feels optimistic. You wander past a row of tents and notice a soldier peeking out, adjusting his blanket. Your eyes meet for half a second. You both freeze, then relax. He gives you a tiny nod, as if to say, yes, we are both awake and pretending we're not. Joke 2, insomnia is apparently timeless. You sit on a low rock near the edge of camp, hugging your knees. The stars feel close, like you could scoop one up and use it as a night light. You think about all the tiny systems you've seen tonight, padded tools, banked embers, cloth-wrapped querns, hidden smells. None of it glamorous. All of it essential. A breeze carries the faintest trace of herbs and ash, and you smile. The kitchen may be gone, but its ghost is still here. Joke 3, congratulations, you are now haunted by dinner. You exhale slowly, letting the quiet settle into your bones. Whatever historians end up deciding about how silent these camps really were, you know one thing for sure, an enormous amount of care went into making them as quiet as humanly possible. And right now, under this heavy, star-soaked sky, that effort feels almost sacred. You push yourself up from the rock and follow the soft shuffle of boots toward the far end of the camp, where a thin line of soldiers is forming in near darkness. They move like shadows learning to walk, each man keeping just enough distance from the next to avoid bumping into armor or accidentally inventing percussion. Someone gently clears his throat and immediately looks guilty about it. Here's your mainstream historical fact for this hushed departure. Hellenistic armies were known to conduct night marches and pre-dawn movements to gain strategic advantage, avoid heat, or surprise enemies. You feel a quiet thrill realizing that the food you helped prepare is about to turn into momentum, muscle, and morale for whatever waits beyond the hills. A soldier passes you with a small cloth bundle tied at his belt. You recognize the shape. Stealth bread. He gives you a tiny nod of thanks, barely perceptible. You return it with the solemn dignity of someone who has personally endorsed his carbohydrate choices. A quirky tidbit floats into your mind as you watch them line up. Some French theories suggest soldiers preferred eating just before a night march because a warm stomach supposedly kept fear and homesickness away. You glance at a young man adjusting his helmet and hope the stew is doing emotional support duty right now. Historians still argue whether night marches were common tactical tools or relatively rare and risky maneuvers that commanders avoided when possible. Looking at the tension in these men's shoulders and the care in every step, you suspect they were used sparingly, like spicy sauce in ancient warfare. A horn sounds softly, not a blast, just a low, breathy note like a tired cow thinking about music. Joke 1, congratulations, you have just heard the world's most apologetic trumpet. The line begins to move. Sandals whisper against dirt. Armor creaks are immediately stifled by hands pressing leather straps tighter. You walk alongside for a few steps, feeling strangely emotional about this extremely quiet parade. A soldier near the back fumbles with his bundle, and you instinctively reach out to steady it. He mouths thank you so dramatically you almost laugh. Joke 2, the Oscar for best silent gratitude goes to that guy. They pass beyond the last tents and into the open dark, silhouettes dissolving into the night like ink in water. You stand still, listening to the sound fade until it's nothing but your own breathing and the faint hum of insects. You realize, with a soft little ache, that your job is done for now. The stews are eaten. The wine is sipped. The bread is tucked into belts. The energy you helped create is walking away into history. Joke 3 drifts in gently. You just catered a very quiet apocalypse rehearsal. You turn back toward the camp, lighter somehow, and carry the echo of their footsteps with you like a secret. You wander back toward the quiet heart of the camp, where the ground is still warm in places from hearts that no longer exist. The stars feel closer now, like they've leaned in to listen, and you tuck your hands into your sleeves, breathing in air that smells faintly of earth, ash, and something comforting you can't quite name. The tents rest in neat rows, silhouettes against the dark, and the whole place feels like it's exhaling after holding its breath all evening. Here's your mainstream historical fact for this final stretch of wandering. Many principles of ancient military logistics, ration planning, portable cooking, fuel conservation, and organized food distribution still shape how modern field kitchens operate today. You imagine a future soldier opening a stainless steel ration pack and unknowingly sharing a tiny kinship with someone who once stirred barley porridge under a Hellenistic sky. A quirky tidbit drifts into your thoughts as you pass a sentry humming softly to himself. Some French historians like to point out that modern military cooks still use quiet hours techniques, such as prepping ingredients earlier in the day and minimizing clatter at night, especially in forward operating bases. You smile. Congratulations, ancient stealth stew, you are officially timeless. Historians still argue whether it's fair to draw a straight line from Hellenistic camp kitchens to modern military catering units, or whether that connection is more poetic than practical. Standing here, surrounded by the invisible ghosts of padded ladles and banked embers, you decide poetry feels accurate enough. You pause near the edge of camp, looking out at the dark hills where the night march disappeared. Somewhere out there, soldiers are walking with warm stomachs and slightly steadier nerves, powered by your quiet labor. Joke 1, you have accidentally become a motivational speaker for carbohydrates. You turn back, slow and unhurried, passing the place where the herbs were crushed, where the stews whispered, where the bread was handed out like secret treasure. The kitchen is gone now, erased so completely it feels like a shared dream. Joke 2 floats gently. You just catered history and forgot to take a single photo. You stretch, feeling pleasantly tired, and settle onto a low rock near a tent. The camp feels safe, contained, almost cozy, in that strange way only temporary places can feel. Joke 3, very softly, 5 stars, would stealth cook again. You close your eyes for a moment, letting the quiet wrap around you, and feel a deep, gentle satisfaction in having been part of something small, careful, and quietly important. You stay seated there on the cool rock, breathing slowly now, feeling the night settle deeper into itself around you. The stars seem to soften, their light less sharp, more like a gentle glow meant just for you. The camp barely exists anymore as a physical place, it feels more like a memory that's still warm at the edges, like a bowl you just finished scraping clean. You think again about the padded ladles, the cloth-wrapped stones, the hidden embers breathing under ash. About hands moving slowly in the dark, about herbs falling into stew like tiny green prayers. About wine warmed gently in earth, bread passed from hand to hand without a word. All of it so quiet. All of it so human. Your shoulders drop. Your jaw unclenches. You realize how calm you feel, as if you've been invited into a secret rhythm that only exists after dusk, when urgency finally loosens its grip and everything moves just a little more gently. You imagine the cooks asleep now, curled in their cloaks, dreaming of barley fields and quiet hearths. You imagine the soldiers walking far away under stars, warmed from the inside by stew and wine and the knowledge that someone cared enough to make dinner quietly. The breeze brushes your face, cool and kind. The night insects hum their low, steady song. Somewhere, far off, a horse shifts its weight and snorts softly, then goes still again. You let your eyelids grow heavy. You tell yourself there's nothing left to do tonight. No pots to stir. No fires to hide. No bowls to dry. Everything that needed to happen has already happened. And you are allowed to rest now. You take one last slow breath in. And one slow breath out. And in the quiet dark, with the ancient camp fading gently behind your closed eyes, you drift towards sleep.